I used to believe in a lot of, I've been an entrepreneur for 15 years, and
Hmm.
I think Silicon Valley was a real inspiration. But
Yeah.
let's just say things have changed, and and I don't think I'm the one who really changed. I think Silicon Valley changed.
Well, there's a big difference between the entrepreneurial startup spirit and then the managerial class comes over and takes over something.
Yeah,
A multi-billion-dollar corporation is not going to be the same as an entrepreneurial organization. So,
yeah. Although it does seem to be attracting the woke managerial class a lot. I mean, I think a lot of startups even now are they've lost that very rebellious
mm,
that they might be doing startups and they might be doing entrepreneurship, but they seem to be conforming to the woke ideals. I think
okay.
um,
Do you
that's
think that
that's my
that
experience.
from your perspective, how does the woke ideology or mindset or whatever that is affect like business decisions, especially when you're creating a business and you don't have millions of dollars to build everything according to a DEI perspective? Like, how does it impact the nimbleness, the flexibility, the I just even just the creativity of a business in its nascent form?
I This is a really really interesting topic. I saw your interview on trigonometry a while back, and I think you brought up a really good point about how like wokeness isn't really compatible with meritocracy. So that I think in maybe in the short term we can't see the effects of that, but I think in the long run it's going to be. I think there's a lot of money in Silicon Valley. There's still a lot of experience. There's a lot of dynamism, I guess, but slowly, I think the lack of meritocracy, the fact that it's got to be all about equity and it's not really about achievement anymore, and it's not about metrics and numbers. It's about I don't know. It's about this weird ideology. I think it's
Mm.
slowly going to chisel away at the effectiveness of these businesses. Which to be fair, it's not that obvious right now because they're still very very successful. But I guess something that gives me hope as I'm building it, I'm trying to build a social network at least,
Hmm.
is I think hopefully it's not that they're not doing the best thing business wise necessarily, or they're not making the best decisions business wise, and I think that opens up a lot of market opportunities. At least
Hmm.
that's my prediction. So I think over time Silicon Valley is probably slowly going to decline, although they are very good at what they do, I must admit.
Hmm. Well, the thing that I've seen is that the adaptation that a certain Marxist either framework or kind of like an algorithm for how to make meaning out of the world by seeing basically there's oppressed groups and oppressor groups, and the right thing, the moral thing, the work is to cause equity to happen, which begins by trying to redistribute, but in the lack of being able to redistribute, let's just say property, it can adapt to redistributing status or redistributing not merit, but just kind of importance, or some sort of social capital can be redistributed. But even though that can't be, what happened at Evergreen and what I've seen in other organizations is that what you do is you kind of attack the people who are perceived or defined as higher up the hierarchy, and that somehow empowers or raises up the people who are lower. So all of that is not about creating a product and then seeing if the product's good or not. It's about this kind of societal activistic work, and it can function if it's padded from reality. It can function within bureaucracies that don't have to show results. And if let's say, with regard to Silicon Valley, they are funded by a deep pockets of investors and speculative capital, and we see a lot of woke capital happening right now. So they don't have to show results in the sense that they're creating a good product. They're trying to create good change, and the product is secondary to that. And eventually, like you're saying, the products that are created there might have something to do to change the makeup of culture at large, but are they really affecting the end user? Are they really providing something that is useful within a certain metric? So with that said, what is your products that you've been working through and inventing over the last 15 years when you got into entrepreneurialism?
Can I just say one more thing on your point, because it's a really
Yeah,
interesting point.
yeah,
I think if you separate out a business or a venture into the product and the team, I think you
yeah.
can make a distinction where I think Silicon Valley is still very, very good at the product side, and they're very focused on metrics on the product side, and obviously they make very good products. I think where the risk is on the team side, but obviously the team is going to have an effect on the product. The product is going to have an effect on the team. But I think where I see that there's more and more problems is on the team side, which you might not see on the product straight away because the product is still very results and numbers driven. But I think over time, as you know, you get these sort of ideologies of math being racist, numbers are going to be racist eventually, and then you're not going to be able to follow the numbers because that would be
I mean, how
a
can you
mistake.
deal with can you deal with machine code if you don't believe in a binary? Eventually, it's just going to erode everything. There was this anonymous Twitter thread, so it was totally anonymous, so I don't know how trustworthy it is at all. But somebody's like, "I'm an insider. I work within a big software company that you probably have heard of," and he goes through the morale of all these meetings and all this self-care and how it's really focused on team health, and people spend a lot of time talking about their problems, and everybody's got multiple pronouns, and there's a lot of identity stuff going into the mix. And the point of that thread, and I don't know if it's trustworthy or not, it was that one of the points was that the companies are running off of old code. They're running off of things that were already created, and now they're not innovating, they're not creating anything new, and the mental health of the teams is deteriorating, under lockdown, under COVID, and then one might assume the victim mindset, or a mindset that prizes pain and the assuaging of harm over, pain is just the weakness leaving your body, old gung-ho patriarchal values and stuff. So how do you avoid that then? What's the solution from your point of view, separating the team from the product and then creating a healthy atmosphere with regard to mental health and team playing and because the team is real, just as real as the product. So you have to deal with the team and boost your team somehow. So how do you know how to do that? What are some of the lessons you've learned?
Well, I think in terms of that context, it's quite well. I made a choice to be in Budapest, Hungary. I grew up in the UK for a while, and then I moved back because I was born here. But it's still, I think, it's still quite a different world here in terms of mentality. People are still very, very ambitious. They still like to create a better life for themselves. There's less of a focus on just these sort of abstract mental health issues, which many people, lots of people have issues. I'm not saying that's not a problem, but maybe sometimes when you have an actual goal or like an actual vision that you're heading towards, that can be more important than just always focusing on myself, which is a bit more of a narcissistic way of looking at things, I guess. So I'd say I have it easier just because of where I am, and Eastern Europe is still really trying to sort of develop and improve itself, and also obviously I recruit the type of people who are probably similar to me, which inevitably happens, and I'm very, very motivated in Retalk's case, building a new platform for people who are frustrated with Silicon Valley tech companies. But in terms of my background, I've always kind of worked on controversial or fringe areas of tech. So my previous business is a website called Pro Privacy, where we teach people how to stay private online. And there
That's controversial? How is that controversial?
Well, I guess sort of privacy is like a maybe if you look at it from Silicon Valley's point of view, you don't really want people to have that much privacy. You want their data. Okay. I'm trying to be on the other side of that, and maybe the next step from privacy is to move into the area of censorship, which I think is becoming a bigger issue now than privacy, and that's where Retalk comes in, where I think I can really make a difference and build a product that can make a huge difference to the world. And I followed the whole, I guess, transformation of the English speaking world by woke ideology, and it's very, very worrying to me. And as someone who's lived in the UK for a long time, it's really sad to see some of the things that are happening. So I really want to do what I can within my capacity, within my power, within what I know, to improve that situation. And I think for me as a tech entrepreneur, building a social network is something that's a very, very difficult task, but it's a very, very worthwhile thing to do. And obviously I'm going to do everything in my power to make it a success.
So I was thinking about this interview. I was thinking about how Facebook started, how YouTube started. YouTube especially was just a startup. Anything goes, Wild West, and it attracted people that were just posting things, and the things could be cringe humor or gross out humor or really not necessarily anti-establishment so much as irreverent humor, and that is what drew the eyeballs. That's what kind of captured the crowd. Facebook was about college students and probably focused on just macking on that macking energy of the young people who just basically want to hook up, and maximizing that, and then playing around with status, and then it grew from there. So those two companies, for example, they grew from very not seedy places, but they were mobilized or interacted with a freshness to the internet, a lot of youthful energy, a lot of youthful content, and then they grew from there. They became legitimate because those people grew up, and then it just became bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Now Facebook has turned into what, like Boomer Farm, right, at this point. Yep. I don't hardly ever go there, but YouTube is pretty freaking phenomenal. For all of the very worrying things about YouTube, it's phenomenal. I can't find any other place where I get this many views. The tools that they give me are great. I mean, they're deleting every 2 out of 10 comments now, just automatically wiping them out. So there's big problems there. Twitter's another area where it started with really easy content, and then it kind of grew. It grabbed enough people where it had its own mass. So how do you redesign that? How do you redesign the social network in the light of how previous social networks came along and kind of grew organically? What do you ride? How do you create or capture the tide to ride to prominence?
Well, for a start, you need a group of people who have enough motivation to start using your product and experimenting. I think in today's world, that's going to be probably frustrated conservatives, right-wing people who feel like maybe they can use Twitter, but they need to self-censor. They can't be completely honest. So I think those people will have a motivation to try a new product. If you ask me what the vision or the mission for Retalk is, I don't want it to be a completely right-wing platform. I want it to be a platform that believes in classical liberal values of sort of, let everyone be free as long as you're not harming anyone else. Okay. So sort of everyone's welcome, but I think right now the target market is someone who's more right-wing, because those people are going to be most frustrated at this point. Okay. But I think a really good analogy, which applies to every single example that you gave, is if you think of like here in Hungary, we used to have this really big music festival, which over the last 15 years, I think grew into a massive festival with hundreds of thousands of people. But when you start a music festival, you're probably going to look for fringe artists. You're probably going to have pretty weird people. You're probably going to have people who like doing experimental, illegal
Okay.
things. You're going
Like a
to
carnival.
yeah,
You
it's not
want
going to
to,
be very mainstream.
yeah, yeah.
But as from year to year, as your festival grows, you're going to get, those weird people are going to tell their less weird friends, then those guys are going to come along. You're going to be able to afford more mainstream bands, and then over time you build this product which is more and more not for people on the fringe of things. It's going to become more and more mainstream, and you're going to have more and more people. And I think with social media, it's the same. And it's exactly what you said about Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, that initially you need, let's say, like a non-mainstream user base who really love it and really use it. And then eventually from that, you can grow the product to become more and more mainstream. So maybe for me right now, that group is people who are really, really frustrated with Silicon Valley companies. But I really hope that I can grow it and it can be for more and more people. And I guess we can get pretty big with sort of millions of users, hopefully.
There's two questions then. One would be how it's built, and then the other is how it's interacted with. And if we think of Internet Web 2.0, I guess it was, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, I think. Is that Web 2.0? I might be wrong. Maybe there was a blogosphere before then.
Yeah, it's Web 2.0 is user-generated content, so it probably started a bit earlier with blogging and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, so user-generated content. And there's what causes it to be used is you can create content and consume content, and it's also addictive. So it's built into these things that they're addictive. With the likes and the shares and the subs and then the traction you can get. So there's the game that it's playing with the human brain. And there's also the internals, how it's built. And so the question is, if you're willing to speak about this, how do you mobilize engagement, I guess is the thing, and create it a reality through this thing, a simulated shared reality, just like what we're living in on other platforms. And then also, are you thinking about how it's built in and of itself, it being different than these other centralized platforms? There's these questions about crypto stuff and blockchain tech and all that stuff that would allow a platform to not succumb to centralization, which might not be a problem for you, or there might be some way to regulate that centralized thing in order for it to maintain the values that you want to see. Two big questions, but I think they're interrelated.
Yeah. Maybe on your second point about centralization, I don't really believe in the sort of. I believe in crypto in terms of the currency stuff, but I don't think a decentralized crypto type of social network will really work, because you really need an entrepreneur and someone driving product development and creating a really, really good product when you have products that really depend on user interactions and a lot of people using them. And like Linux is a really good example. I mean, Linux is there, but hardly anyone uses it. Only geeks use it because it doesn't have that user interface that people can use it easily. And I think if you try and create a distributed social network, you're going to run into the same problems that Linux ran into versus, say, Apple. So, Apple has like a really strong leader in Steve Jobs, who is driving UX, driving products, making sure things work properly. And you can see where the iPhone ended up. So I think social network is similar because you need everyone to be on social media, and you need really, really good product development, which if you don't have centralization, it's I think a really, really hard task. But I could be wrong.
Just in for example, you're talking about the user interface and all the different bells and whistles that are embedded in there. They can't be judged and refined without some sort of centralized planner and driving force. That's your contention. And if you just put out this I don't know how that would work on a social media sphere, how it would not be like the user interface itself is designed, but the underlying tech of, I guess, sharing all these bits of user generated content, that is blockchained. I mean, there's Odyssey and other things that are trying to do that, but can you give me an example so I can see?
Theoretically, what you could have is you could have all the content on a blockchain, and then you could have apps that actually selectively select which parts of that content you can actually see in the app.
Okay.
So you could have like an undestructible blockchain storage of content which you can't censor. What kind of product do you build on top of that, and who builds that product? Is it a concerted effort between open source developers? Is it a company that does that? But then as soon as it's a company, it becomes a lot more centralized.
Because you're choosing what people see.
Yeah.
Like you need to build the algorithms that drive engagement. And, you know, with Twitter, I get a central news feed where I'm having problems with it, but because it's just showing me the same content over and over and over again. But you're saying that somebody's going to have to do the selecting, and the selecting by definition is centralized.
Yeah. And especially because in tech, you can't, like it's a really, really nice dream to have, you know, censorship resistant, zero censorship content and newsfeed, but you run into so many problems. The biggest one probably being child porn. Like every single platform that's ever been created as sort of no censorship ends up with loads and loads of child porn. But you know, you have people pretending they're not advertising when really they're advertising. You have people just trolling you, and trolls can be a big problem in a community because they are actively trying to destroy conversation. You potentially have foreign governments interfering with the content. So you have to, you know, there has to be some sort of control on what you display, and at that point you're going to start centralizing censorship or moderation or whatever you want to call it. So my theory, I guess, is that you have to let the market solve these problems, and the market will create lots and lots of different social media companies. And you can see, you know, TikTok came out of nowhere. Odyssey.
They kind of had the Chinese government behind them, if you believe the rumors, though.
Yeah, well, let's hope there'll be other examples. But I think it's a long game. It's not going to be an instant change. But rather than thinking about decentralized, no censorship, I think it's going to be about choosing who moderates your content and what the ideology of the person who moderates is going to be.
Okay, so just like the music festival where you might have a little bit of gray area in some places more than others, there's definitely not going to be a black market in this one because it'll be burned down and closed down. So we can't have, there's some obvious lines between what makes something illegal and what makes something illiberal. And the troll, you bring up the troll because this is the $40 million question. Like, what do you do with trolls? And how do you ever read? Like, I'm a troll sometimes. I use sarcasm and irony. Are you going to ban that? Like, how can I make sense if I can't do that? And then how can an algorithm, how can any individual decide what's troll and what's not troll, what's acceptable trolling, what's not acceptable trolling? Like, have we... I mean, what kind of philosophical groundwork do we need to lay to figure out how to deal and read trolling for what it is?
So maybe bringing in how Retalk actually works. Retalk is a bit like Facebook groups. So we build communities around interests. So you will have like a community about gardening, about history, about politics. And I think when you think about moderation in terms of communities and not in terms of what an individual does, it becomes a really different problem, because communities actually have their own, this is really sort of psychology. Communities start to have their own vocabulary, their own behaviors, their own rituals. And so a community, I think, can potentially decide what a troll is, and they can potentially moderate that troll or censor them. And that's fine, because you're saying, here's a community, do you want to be part of it or not? If you don't, do you want to obey the rules or not?
Yeah.
And if you don't want to, that's fine. Create your own community. So it's not excluding anyone, but it's about communities and about communities setting their own rules. And you can have lots and lots of different communities with lots and lots of different rules.
Okay, so we're in Reddit territory.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Reddit itself is really interesting, and I don't know what happened to it, but I'm pretty sure it's Hillary Clinton's fault. But in the run up to the 2016 election, one of her super PACs just what is called astroturfed the site, and there was a lot of Bernie things going on, Bernie Sanders stuff going on, and then Hillary Clinton poured a bunch of money, and it was like bots, or they hired people to go in, and then once Trump got elected, the entire site, almost the entire site, went hard progressive left. And every community can be regulated and moderated, but you have these super mods that are basically controlling what information gets out there and who they're going to ban. And then there's just like wars between these different clans. They finally got the Trump site banned, or the Trump subreddit. There's a lot of drama there, but it started, in 2010, 2012, 2013. It was a great place to go. And it was more about the comments for me, just reading the comments on the articles. There's just a lot of funny people there. And then it became too political, and that corrupted it tanked the entire site. So I only go there now for very limited, like I want to look about cars, I want to read about shockwaves, or watch shockwave porn and these other little tiny interests. And so I don't have to deal with the politics there, because the political discussions there is really bad. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, and how Retalk would foster those communities, and then, what your thoughts are on community conflict, or if you're going to maximize that, build that into it, demonetize that part, all that.
Not sure how that would work, but
yeah, I don't know.
I guess many of those issues I'm not big enough to have had to deal with yet.
Okay,
that'll be a fun thing, but
So I guess you could just talk about how it's actually set up with these communities, how people can find the communities, and how they're built up. Is it kind of like a forum, like a Reddit forum, where it's like slash Puget Sound, or slash this, slash that?
Yeah, we kept a lot of that kind of thing. So it's rather than r slash, we have c slash, and then a community name. But you can actually, our user base is actually fairly. It's like 40 or 50 plus. So in terms of user interface, we need to make it as easy as possible. I started out with similar formats to Reddit. So with a U for the username and C for the communities. But I realized that's maybe sort of a legacy thing that Reddit always had. So it's still got, but it's not really necessary to building the product, and it actually interferes maybe with some people. So. So, we have our own sort of news feed, which has the most popular posts. You can search for communities, or we highlight top communities and recommended communities. So we try and make it as easy as possible to find new communities, especially because I think what you said is quite important, that if there's a lot of politics on Retalk, but I think if it stays as only politics, that's not, it's tiring. It's not something that long-term you maybe want to interact with. I think it's a lot more interesting if you've got, politics is one part of it, but it's also your hobbies. It's also gardening. It's also motorbikes or whatever you like. So I'm trying really, really hard to encourage non-political communities to be built, because I think that's going to mean it's a much, much better platform. And there's been lots and lots of attempts to copy Reddit before. And I think one of the issues with all of those has been that they always seem to turn into very, very political websites. So hopefully I can improve on that.
Yeah. The thing about Twitter that has been most useful for me is that it's based on me.
Twitter or Reddit?
Twitter.
Twitter.
Did I say
Yeah.
Twitter?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Twitter is based on me. So it's my account, it's my followers, I am the community, my topics rule. Either my topics float or not, and I look at the site and see what gets the points and what gets popular. And it's not content that I want to create, but I can create varieties of content and I have control. So it's more centralized for me. And Twitter, over the past 6 months or so, they've been trying to force me to follow topics, and it's just not what I want to do on Twitter. I don't want to follow topics. I want to follow individuals, because the individual it's more of a networking thing. And then I've been able to build my YouTube channel by networking through Twitter, finding good voices and just kind of rolling the dice on a bunch of different strangers and finding a topic and then creating a topic out of the resource pool. So it's kind of like where I get my business. It's kind of like a fishing expedition for me. I'm always like trawling rather than trolling, and I do a little bit of trolling to because I get a signal and stuff. So that's why it's become so valuable to me. And then also on the other end is that there's YouTube, which is all just my channel. It's my content, and so I guess those two sides are most useful because I'm a content creator, and that's how I think of myself. That's how I interact with myself and others. And I'm just wondering, is there that? Have you guys thought about the self versus the community thing? Because then that brings up what we were saying about censorship, because how do you thread that? So I'm just wondering, do you create an avatar? Is it like a metaverse? Are you guys thinking down the road? You got your goggles on, you can just live in this retalk?
I think that's just Zuckerberg who wants to do that. No, I actually made a very conscious choice about exactly this question. Okay. I think if you're going to build a Twitter alternative like Getter and Parler is trying to do, it's you need the VIPs, you need the important people who are posting, who are interesting. You need the content creators, and I think for that you need a lot of resources. And I also think it's a big risk. So with Parler, as soon as the important people leave, the platform pretty much collapses. So I made a very, very conscious choice to go down the Reddit route, because I think for me, with less resources, and also I personally prefer the Reddit format. I think if I can build a community and it's all about grassroots interaction and it's all about just random people posting and discussing things, that builds a community, but it builds a grassroots community that isn't based on important people posting. And even if someone leaves, the community is still there. And I hope that creates a more sustainable platform, I guess. At least that was my thinking behind it. And just based off what's happened on Parler, and I think what I can see on Getter now is, there was this huge influx of users after Joe Rogan posted about it. But to me, it seems like 2 weeks on, no one's really posting anymore. Everyone's just copying their Twitter feed. So it's super, super hard to get content creators to switch platforms. But to create a new community, I think it seems harder, but it's actually easier. So I made that choice at the beginning because I think for me, the best chance is building a Reddit type of platform. If I had $100 million, maybe I made a different choice, but I don't. So there we go.
Well, so speaking in terms of Reddit, how are you thinking of different tools? Is this basically text and chat based content, and is there up and down voting? How do you reward people and then have the users filter the content by evaluating it and choosing which is more important and not?
Yeah, it's text, image, and link posts mostly. I'd love to add video, but we're not quite there yet. And then users up and down vote it. They can comment on it, and that creates a news feed of the most popular content. And then we've slowly sort of started adding in that you can also follow other users potentially, and then we can show you content from people that you follow. But that's kind of secondary to the Reddit format of just having discussion topics and people discussing things. Yeah, but upvotes and downvotes give you sort of the ranking, and that's how we list things on the newsfeed.
What's your thought about just to broaden the conversation a little bit? What's your thoughts about like Discord like things and Twitch? With Discord, there's communities of content, but it's much more talky and much more discussion based. And I don't even know if you can post things in Discord. It's so weird. I don't really understand
Yeah,
Discord.
it's more just channels. Like,
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's added value added for people to be able to have meetups, have game nights through?
Well, it's more, yeah, it's more real time. I think. I mean, maybe I guess I grew up on the 90s, 2000s internet, and maybe I'm a dinosaur now, but I like that, you know, if I see a post on Retalk, I can go back 8 hours later and still see it and comment on it. And whereas on Discord, you know, it's just like, tuck, 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 tuck. It's mostly just chatting, which for work, that's what we do. But for enjoyment, I never quite got into the Discord side of things. Even though I am sometimes a gamer, although now that I have children, less so.
Is there a question about making social media, just rethinking it as something that is both a place where people work and use for work and a place that they use for enjoyment? That's an interesting distinction, because that's what Twitter is to me. Like I use it for both work and pleasure. Yeah.
Well, theoretically, that's kind of what Mark Zuckerberg is trying to do with Meta. So I think this is just a theory, but I think it's the most plausible theory. Is that you shouldn't be thinking about Meta as like a game and like a virtual reality world where you can, I don't know, build a house or whatever. The way you should think about it is Zoom, but in 3D. So initially it will actually be about work. That makes more sense. And it also makes sense in terms of the hardware, because you're probably not going to buy $1,000 glasses from Facebook to go into a virtual world, but your company might buy $1,000 glasses if it's going to mean that you have better meetings. So I think this is actually quite plausible that if the technology gets good enough, initially Meta is actually going to be like workspaces and like shared work rooms and meeting rooms where you can have meetings, and you'll be doing it from home, but it'll feel like you're in a meeting room with your co-workers. So in that way, I guess Facebook is trying to move into the enterprise market. We'll see if they succeed or not. But I know that Mark Zuckerberg's been quite obsessed with trying to get Facebook to become a work thing as well, and he's never managed to do it. So I think people do like to compartmentalize their different social networks. I think everyone intuitively feels that like, you know, LinkedIn is for work, Facebook is for my parents, and Instagram is for my friends, or something like that. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And with the pro-privacy work that you've been doing, what does that look like? How do you perceive privacy being linked to our individuality going forward in the internet, as our avatars, as our virtual avatars become more and more embedded in the realm of the digitalis? How does privacy and the awareness of privacy, how is that going to help us or hinder us going forward? Like, what are some of the big concerns that, or just the principles of privacy? And do you see that as something that governments need to get involved with, or regulators need to be involved with? And what are your thoughts on that?
I must admit that it seemed, as much as I always try and be on the side of free markets, it seems like if there was, you know, there's all this new regulation about privacy now. It started in the EU with GDPR, and it's getting its versions in the US now, I think, and elsewhere. And I kind of wonder what would happen if those legislations wouldn't have come along, because Facebook and Google do seem to be so dominant in terms of just tech generally, and they are hoovering up absolutely everything, that I don't know at what point the market would have, I don't know, found a solution to that. I mean, pro-privacy is about kind of teaching people about solutions like ad blockers, VPNs, secure backups, things like that. But for the majority of people, it seems like they don't actually really care about their data that much. It does feel a bit like I've been fighting a losing battle. So it's interesting that this legislation has come along, because it's definitely restricted Facebook and Google a bit, and it's given data kind of back to the people. But I'm always a bit worried when it's about government regulation, and you never know what consequences the government regulation actually has.
Like me having to accept cookies every time I go to the same site, every single freaking time, all the time. Yeah. Accept your cookies. Remember my choice? No, I forgot. Accept cookies. Sorry, I hate freaking cookies.
A couple of times I've actually worked out sort of if you multiply the amount of seconds that's wasted for humanity, like how many human years have you wasted clicking on cookie banners? And
have you figured it out?
Ridiculous.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's an open question. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody will weaponize the autism to defeat that particular calculation.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. Yeah.
But that's like that. Yeah. So you're exactly right. And that's the problem when you have bureaucracies creating things like that. Because I think the good solution to that would be you in your browser, so Safari or Firefox or whatever, you say, in this case, I want cookies. In this case, I don't. In this case, I want these choices. And then Firefox and Safari just tells the website that those are your choices. And then that's the default.
Yeah.
And that would solve so much clicking, but
Yeah. Or tapping. Yeah. It's insane. Yeah. So you, I'm just curious about Hungary's position geopolitically and how that informs your cultural climate. So you were born and then you migrated and then you immigrated, returned. So what's the, I guess the thing that I would think as an American is that you guys are gung-ho and meritocracy is important and ambition is fostered because you guys came out of a period of time in the shadow of a very strong superpower that was rather repressive. Thinking of communism a little bit, and then so how's that impact the culture the last, I guess, 40 years once the Berlin Wall fell, which was 33 years ago or something like that. And
wow, 33 now. I think probably part of the reason why maybe something like Retalk has started in Hungary by a Hungarian. We are slightly or very immune to this sort of woke ideology or this far left ideology, and it's not just because we suffered it from communism, but it's like the West seems to be dominated by guilt right now. That's what I can see. It's all about how bad people are and feeling bad about your history and feeling bad about almost anything you can feel bad about. And it just doesn't work here, because our history is full of people trying to invade us and destroy us. And for us, history and probably our consciousness is about surviving and not about, if I've done something wrong or not. It doesn't really matter. We had to survive. So I think in today, bringing that into today's world, I think a lot of people don't really understand why the West is going in the direction that it's going, and why there's so much guilt about certain things when at the same time it's the West that actually created the entire philosophy around liberty and around the individual, which is so important and probably one of the most important inventions of humanity, just to focus on the individual.
Is that where, do you sense that in your fellow countrymen, a liberal, what's called classically liberal mindset, individualist, bootstrap work your butt off, take your knocks, create something beautiful. That kind of
I
innovative spirit, perhaps even.
I think it's because I lived in the UK. I maybe I'm more attuned to this kind of thing. I mean, Europe and Central Europe classically hasn't been very individualist in terms of our history. It's always been more collectivist than
Tribal, oh, kind of. You got
yeah,
your
you could
soccer
say that.
team.
Yeah.
You know, you're gonna flip off your neighbor countries. You know, and
Or just, I mean, there's so many different languages that you inevitably have tribes because everyone speaks a different
okay,
language.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
It is Hungary got a bunch of different languages, or like one national language?
Not anymore. So throughout our history, there was times when Hungary was a lot bigger, and we had like different Slavic tribes speaking different languages. But now it's just Hungarian here.
Okay, no.
But I so it's not a perfect world where we're all very individualistic and it's the new US. I definitely wouldn't say that, and government is still pretty big here and has a big influence. But I think just there is some sort of underlying ambition in and an underlying we still want to further ourselves and develop somewhere, whereas I think the West has maybe gotten a bit tired somehow and and is more concerned with being all the guilt of what you've done in the past, which no one's alive who's done all those bad things, so it's not the West's fault, I don't think, anymore.
Is the government, Hungarian government, skewed conservative then, or even anti-woke? Or are they banning, I don't know, gender theory or something in colleges or something like that? What's the political makeup and attitude of politicians?
They're definitely very anti-woke. They just.
Do you guys still have a royalty? Sorry.
No.
Do you no. Okay. So it's a democratically elected.
Yeah.
And probably a lot of social services too. You said government's pretty big, so you don't have to worry about.
Yes, I think economically, I wouldn't say it's very conservative or right wing, but culturally, I think it definitely is right wing, I guess. Yeah.
And so those things are in tension on one level, but they work together on another level. A kind of a community spirit that still fosters the individual, because we're always. We can't just go hard individual and we can't go hard collective. Like there's always going to be an interplay between those values and those forces in life. So every country, every state, even in the Americas, we try to tool around with that. Every community is going to tool around with that, where they distribute that.
I think the way to think about it is, I hate it when journalists throw around this thing about populism, but it is kind of about that, and it's I don't know how much you know about Disraeli in the UK, who sort of created one nation Toryism. He realized that to bring the aristocracy and the working class together, you need patriotism, because both the aristocracy and the working class are generally patriotic, whereas the middle class isn't. And I think that's kind of what you have here in Hungary now as well. Is you have a leadership that's catering to the patriotism of the working class, but because they're catering to the working class, economically they're actually fairly left wing, but it kind of works because it's like a economically left wing but patriotic leadership.
Yeah. Nationalistic then. Which is easy to do when you have the history that you have, because it's kind of built in with the language, and then these people are going to invade us, or they used to invade us, and blah blah blah. We used to be owned by these. That's really interesting.
I think I'd love to see what would happen if we like I'm very libertarian and individualistic, and I'd love to see what would happen if Hungary was sort of more libertarian, but. That would be an interesting alternative history kind of test, because I don't know if a country is very libertarian, but at the same time you're always getting invaded by someone else, that might be a death wish, really. So it might not
Yeah.
be possible.
Yeah, that's the calculus that you have to work out as a libertarian. It's like, well, are you going to want people protecting your private property or not? What are you going to do about that? Is there a sense? This is kind of philosophical, maybe even artistic in a way. Is there a sense of the Hungarian man, the Hungarian individual? Is there an ideal kind of character for the nation, like the values that are encapsulated? And I'm not talking about that might have been presented very crudely in propagandistic terms, but I don't know if you can have a patriotism without some sort of particularity that would be eventually kind of idealized in either a person of the past or a person of the future. Do you have a sense of that, what that character is?
Well, the caricature probably
Yeah.
is sort of a very skeptical, very negative person who doesn't like it when someone else succeeds. But interestingly, to me there's an interesting flip side to that, where Hungarian history is full of really, really exceptional individuals, and it's almost like to you have to fight really, really hard to not be pulled back here. But the people who actually manage to fight that fight fight so hard that they become really, really successful.
Oh,
So
interesting. Okay.
there's a lot of there's sports personalities, there's scientists, and they all somehow became outsiders from Hungarian society, and were all rejected by Hungarian society. But I think that maybe that's part of their success, is that they had to fight really hard to actually lift themselves out from society. Yeah.
That's really interesting. That there's this wonderful. I can't. Is a couple of years ago. I watched the videos. There's a couple of great videos about. I think it's Sweden, one of the Nordic countries, and it talks about. It compares it to, or it brings up the Bernie Sanders line, or that progressive line before progressivism kind of got captured by the woke ideology, about always looking to the Swedish and to the Nordic model of statehood and socialism. And, there's this type of socialism that is really beneficial for these people. And this Swedish guy goes through, he says, okay, well, here's the cost benefit. Actually, it's not socialist, it's hyper capitalistic, but the actual individuals of my country, they're very passive. They really dislike people who are different or exceptional, and all of the exceptional people end up moving to America. So there's this cultural, there's this give and take in this culture where that I feel like you're evoking, where due to the circumstances, due to the age of your country, it's kind of caused a calcification of like a kind of narrow mindset towards what is proper, what's improper, and anybody who's out of the fold needs to leave. Or, if you're too successful, you're no longer one of us, because the identity is somehow there's kind of like maybe you can't go too low either. You'll get kicked out of society. I don't know. Like if you go too low in your behavior, then you're no longer one of us. If you go too high, so there's this kind of marginal, kind of acceptable Overton window of personality and of even achievement. I'm just riffing here, but I'm just thinking about that because I'm American. I live in a completely different history. My cultural history is very different. I don't have a lot of ties to the past. So
Yeah, but I guess what's really worrying to me is America was always there as that opportunity, and exactly what you said about Sweden happens here as well. That a lot of successful or talented people go to the US, and that's where they sort of really can grow and be successful. But I think for 50 years, but maybe for longer, the US was always kind of the hope for so much of the world, and it seems like that's dying a little bit, and it's so sad. I mean, it's because I think it's so. Yeah, it's really hopeful to have somewhere where you can go, where you can be an individual and you can try and achieve things as an individual, and you'll be respected and rewarded, and that's probably why so many immigrants were so successful in the US. And I don't know, like more than 50% of the biggest companies in the US were founded by immigrants. So obviously that works really well as a model. But I mean, I would question how many people want. It still works because historically there's still that reputation. But let's just say if the US follows on this path, then it might not be as attractive in the future.
So your perspective on America might be colored somewhat by your application. Is it an application or is it a site? How do you think of Retalk? Is it an app, a site,
social network? I don't know. It's
a
both.
network.
It's an app and a website. Yeah.
So you said that you know that the age of your population is 40s and 50s, and are they mostly, I guess, Western? Is it mostly in English, and is it?
Yeah, it's
the conservative frustrations are very American conservative frustrations.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, if you glance at Retalk for 2 seconds, you can see it's mostly frustrated US right-leaning people. But I mean, that's also kind of a conscious choice for me, is because the US is the biggest market, biggest English-speaking market. It's got very specific politics, so it's a really good starting place for starting an app like this. Initially I did try and target the UK as well, but for the product, it was better to just concentrate on one country at once, because there's one news feed, and it's hard to surface UK content for UK people. So it just seems better to start off with the US and then maybe add on other countries later on.
Interesting. Okay, so that will. I wonder to what extent American politics. We criticize Americans for kind of projecting our politics across the world, but it's the world that's absorbing our politics too. And our politics are kind of shaped by how we get feedback from the rest of the world. And because we package our politics in such colorful ways, and like, just if you think about the reaction, to quote the current president of the United States, Joseph Biden, the murder of George Floyd was more impactful to the world than was the assassination of MLK, and he actually said that. But I think that there's truth in that. I think that there was something about the consciousness, the zeitgeist of that time, that caused the George Floyd death to be so meaningful, because America had exported a certain sort of racial black and white thinking, such a very contentious, simplified way of thinking that everybody could join and rise against racism. Even in Japan, they have Black Lives Matter things, and one of the most xenophobic countries out there. But so it's interesting to see you kind of maximizing that, but then just the question is, how do you figure out how to export that or allow that to have breathing room when it does go so toxic? If America is falling, then we're going to be spewing our woke dogmas out across the rest of the world. And if you see that as toxin, how are you going to say, okay, well, I want to capitalize on the energy, but I also want to just take the best parts of this American spirit, and try to figure out how to filter out the stuff that I don't necessarily want.
Yeah, see, that's something I haven't thought about. So maybe you should be a business consultant as well. Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, it does filter through everywhere. I think US politics. And I know I was listening to a lot of UK commentators about the whole BLM thing, and it is really crazy how police brutality in the UK doesn't hardly ever exist, or it's minimal. And then why do you get BLM protests in the UK when policemen are generally sort of really nice gentlemen, and they're very polite, and they don't have guns, but still you have this massive kind of BLM craze in the UK as well.
Yeah. Well, I think not only was it fueled by the exporting of the American racial politic and our very contentious, very cartoonish story, and I don't mean that it's not based on reality and it's not a very powerful story, but it is story. It is a very big narrative, and that it would be taken up by the UK, I think, had to have been fueled by the COVID lockdowns. This was a bunch of kids that were cooped up, who were given no access to do what's most natural to them, which is fuck and fight and fly all over the place. And then they finally had a cause, and then it was politically expedient for the governments of the Western world to foster and allow that to happen. Because they knew that, well, if we give them this, then we can... I'm sorry to be a little conspiratorial, but they knew what they were doing. The elite knew what they were doing by allowing that to happen, covering
And obviously,
for it, and using it to entrench.
Virus doesn't spread at BLM protests, so that's
no,
fine.
no. Well, yeah, of course, yeah, of course, yeah. So, what do you guys do with COVID medical misinformation? Do you come down with the little penned things? The CDC guidelines have updated. You should better change what you guys are talking about on Retalk. Do you guys?
No, we have
deal with it. You don't have to deal with misinformation because the viewership isn't huge. Once it becomes huge, like once Twitter becomes Twitter, then it has to make choices. Once YouTube becomes YouTube, it has to make these choices, and it's easy to not make those choices when you're not powerful enough, right? So
yeah, and when you don't have, it's definitely must be tough, I think, for Twitter and Facebook, and they've got the whole mainstream advertising dollars who probably don't want to be, show their advertising next to controversial issues. So, I hope at some point I'll have to make these hard choices, but we'll see. But on your censorship point, I think something that's I think worth highlighting is when COVID started breaking out in China. Most governments and most authorities were sort of saying it's nothing serious, it doesn't spread between humans, it's all fine. In the meantime, Twitter was actually going crazy, sort of saying, no, come on, there's something going on, this is really bad, people are getting sick, there's something is going on, something is wrong. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about social media, is that can happen because you have people actually talking and they can actually reveal the truth to each other. But if you're always going to say, let's just trust the authority, we know, it's always right, vaccines are always safe, there's nothing wrong, you're saying that forever you're going to trust the authorities and they're never ever going to get anything wrong. I think it's much better to let people discuss it, and then potentially you can find out information that might actually be right and the authorities could have gotten wrong. But the price for that is that sometimes, the crowd can be wrong, but the crowd can be right. It's both sides of the same coin.
So, I mean, that's the question about centralization, and it's not just about who gets to see who gets to say what, but who gets to see what when, and the conscious decisions that the content farms make and install in there for engagement, and then also to ensure, prosperity and legality, and avoid litigation for not being a hand in, I don't know, the death of 1 million people by letting some rumor spread, or something like that. So it's just the politic of who is the authority. Even that, it's fascinating beyond just the product level, but just the psychology of who's right about COVID and who is right when about COVID, and the reactions to that. And it's always changing. And I'm not a scientist, so every time I open my mouth about this, I'm like, I probably shouldn't talk because I don't know, but something's weird here. But also everybody's going crazy because the stakes are so high. This is life and death. And if it's not just life and death with the virus, it's life and death of our society. It's life and death of how we interact with each other. Like, everything's turned up. And so everybody's turned up. And so it's really hard to see anything clearly because there's just so much motion in the water.
But it feels like the fact that everything's gotten so politicized has definitely made science worse or not as effective. I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if these authorities and these NIH and et cetera, if they've always been like this, and it's always been humans in charge who make mistakes, who become corrupt, et cetera, or if it's gotten worse somehow because it is so political and everything is so political. It feels like science has gotten a lot more politicized recently, but maybe it was always so.
Well, it's hard because I don't see how it can't be political if it has to do with daily living. If it's impacting people's lives, it's by definition political. So how do you keep that from not being political? And there's a lot of questions about sovereignty and personal choice, and then community responsibility. Those things are in tension. That is politics. How's Hungary dealing and surviving through the pandemic?
Surprisingly libertarian, let's call it, or surprisingly sort of just, yeah.
Wash your hands and don't spit on people.
Yeah, pretty much. It's become a bit more authoritarian in terms of the vaccines, but a lot of people were complaining in Hungary, saying, "Oh, why doesn't the government do something? Let's lock down. We need more restrictions." And definitely compared to many other countries, we had much shorter lockdowns, which I think was a really, really good choice, especially we haven't destroyed our own economy in the last 2 years. It's
okay.
All my favorite restaurants are still around, which I'm.
Oh, okay. Did the borders tighten then? Is that one of the defensive maneuvers that it closed down?
It was only at the very beginning when we, when no one actually knew anything about COVID. We were properly locked down, like playgrounds were closed, everything was closed. But as soon as I think the government realized that where I guess they followed the actual science that, playgrounds, etc., in the open air, it doesn't spread, things like that. All the silly rules that many other countries had about masking outdoors, things like that, we didn't have because I think it was following the science a bit more, maybe. And
vax passports, is that what they're doing now?
Yeah.
They're going in that direction. Has there been unrest, or does the population want that?
Surprisingly not. Yeah.
Okay.
But maybe because yes, we have vaccine passports, but you hardly need it for anything. You need it for like events over 500 people. It's not like, some countries you can't go outdoors now. Australia, I think, or West Australia, you can't even exercise now without it. So
yeah, I don't know about Australia. That's a whole other topic. I'm like, I don't know. I'm gonna open my mouth about that. But
my sister actually lives in Australia, and she was saying,
oh, okay, there you go.
It's actually not Australia. People should stop saying it's Australia. It's Western Australia, apparently.
Okay. Yeah.
Apparently most of Australia is okay. Year and a half. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Yeah. Oh, so during lockdown then she's been there.
Yeah.
This has gone on too long. It's 2 years now. It's been too long.
Even here, where there haven't been lockdowns, I've had enough of the whole thing now.
Yeah. Fed up. Well, at least you're creating a virtual life and livelihood. And so, let's plug your work. Do you have like a tech blog?
Best is probably if you just go to Retalk or search for Retalk app and just register, and then you'll get the newsletters and
cool.
And you'll see posts from me. So I'm not that active on Twitter, although you can find me there as well. But obviously I'd rather use my own platform. So
yeah. And what's the roadmap for it? What are some milestones that you guys are looking for or toward in 2022?
So from my previous ventures, I'm in a fairly good financial position, and I've funded this completely myself so far. But I can only take that so far in terms of actual advertising and distribution. So I think probably the second half of this year, I'd like to get to a stage where we've got a decent size active user base, and then hopefully I can get investment from someone to kind of really explode the user growth, because that's the really expensive part is growing the brand, getting the signups. The development is actually not fairly, I wouldn't say easy, but it's a smaller part of the challenge. It's more distribution. So I'm probably going to start looking for investment in the second part of the year.
Okay. And so is that does that mostly about just putting it in people's path, putting Retalk in people's path, and showing them what it is, and just trying to get people hooked on it.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
hey kid, you want some social media?
Yeah, getting advertising on podcasts and relevant people's podcasts, advertising on other platforms.
What's your favorite community on Retalk? The one that you find most delicious?
Let's see.
I guess I don't want you to play favorites, though. I guess that's not fair for you to play favorites.
Let's say like my favorite post recently, and there's a guy who posts some pretty good things on the history community. He posted a picture of, was it the Battle of Tripoli? I don't know if that exists, but two bullets collided in midair, and there's a picture of the bullets that actually collided and they stuck together. Thought that was an amazing picture.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah.
Eventually that would have happened, but it's nice to have that.
Yeah.
Wait, was the picture of them smashing into each other? Or
that would have been, yeah.
That's a 1 in a million.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Pete, it was great talking to you. Thanks for showing up to my show and
thanks for having me.
Informing people about the ins and outs of media startup. I keep on coming back personally to entrepreneurialism is one leg of redemption for Western society. One, it's community, it's individual taking care of themselves, regulating themselves, educating themselves, but it's also entrepreneurialism and the startup spirit and the innovators and the people who actually deal with customers. They're the ones who get the most out of life, even if they lose over and over again. Get so much wealth of experience and reality injected in your veins by doing that.
I mean, for me personally, I think as long as Elon Musk can keep firing his rockets up into space, I'm inspired, and the US is still good for entrepreneurship. So okay, I really hope he can still do that.
We'll just keep on snatching those crazy foreigners and having them come over and do crazy things on our soil. All right, well, I'm going to wrap up the recording.